Hey guys, welcome to Houdini Houdono, the simulation edition, and we are on episode 7, right? So we are 3 more episodes to finishing this mini-series on quick and effective simulation tips. I hope you're enjoying the series so far. There was a lot of response from the Ferrero Rocher tutorial, the one that's flowy chocolate, and yeah, thanks for all the response, man. I received a lot of DMs requesting for the hip files. All of you who DM'd got the link to the hip file. Please share with me your results, right? Follow along the tutorial, share with me your results, and yeah, just excited to see what you guys come up with. That was an hour-long tutorial. I hope you guys don't find it too long. It was quite a long process to edit that video too. So I think for this week we are gonna cut it shorter. I'm gonna show you a very cost-effective smoke simulation, right? Back in my schooling days, smoke simulation is one of the very difficult things to do, and nowadays with Houdini and softwares like this, it's actually much less daunting to do smoke simulations. So let's we'll have a look into it today, right? So we are going to do a wind tunnel effect, as you can see on your screen now. Okay, allow me to briefly explain what we're going to achieve today. Okay, so what is a wind tunnel effect? It's basically an effect, a very basic smoke simulation effect that allows us to demonstrate how streamlined a product is. So it's very good for like gaming mouse commercials and sports car commercials, or just any commercial that wants to demonstrate some level of ergonomics or streamlinedness or speed in its form, and we can use this effect. How we're generally going to approach this is to first have a model. So I'm going to draw a sphere here. So this is our model, and what we're going to have to do is then maybe have ground, right? And then we're going to have like a emission source, so maybe three points. If you have too many points of emission, what happens is you don't get to see the way one of the lines form and go across. It gets a bit crowded, so you cannot see the details in the line. So just be careful to not overdo it. Yeah, so I think 2 to 3 to 4 is still okay. Once you have too many, then it just becomes a big mess. What will generally happen is, based on the default simulation settings and the form, it should go over the form like this, or around the form like this, in a way that complements the form. Hopefully it's flattering for the form. And if it doesn't do that, I mean, our job as designers is to make sure that the idea gets across, right? So if for instance the smoke starts to go all wonky and upwards, and it doesn't speak so well of the streamlinedness of the product, that is where we will add some guides. We'll draw some lines to act as guides to make sure that our velocity then does this, right? And that will speak much better of the streamlined nature of the product that we're talking about. So in this example here, I'm going to be using a human skull that I modeled in Blender, sculpted in Blender. So I think I can provide you a model of this human skull. It's not the greatest model, but it does its job. So for example, the human skull here, what we're going to do is to place 3 emission sources here and just run a simulation, and it should go. Yeah, so basically this is the approach that what we're gonna do today. So that's it. That's basically our approach today. I will explain in Houdini itself if it needs a bit more explanation on how generally a volume simulation works. So let's list down the steps to achieve this. So 1 is we will prepare a model. 2, prepare the emission. 3 is to do the smoke simulation, a pyro sim, and 4 is to then guide this sim using some custom velocity vectors. Alright, so I think that's enough of introduction. Let's get into Houdini now. Here I have an empty scene. I'll drop down a geometry node. It's a good habit to keep everything into one geo node, rename it, setup, and dive inside. Drop down a file node and source in the skull, and then drop down a match size node to place it on the floor. By changing justify Y to minimum, that automatically places it on the floor. And before the match size, I'm just going to drop down a transform node and rotate the skull along the x-axis, and you can see that we can do a tumbling skull. Whee! Okay, anyway, that's not what we're gonna do. Just jump to the side view, spacebar 4, and you can just rotate this manually until it kind of like both contacts hits the ground like this. And so this is our source geometry. So spacebar 1 to switch back to a perspective view. So step 1 done. Then next we are going to drop down a line, and we are going to match size this line to the skull like this. Yeah, so it's somewhere centered in the skull. And drop down a transform node. I'm going to template this match size. And then on this transform node, I'm just gonna hit enter on my keyboard and move this forward to say 5 units ahead, and just resample it and click on my point display. I have too many points here. As mentioned earlier, I only want 2 to 3 points, so I'm just gonna uncheck maximum segment length and check maximum segments, and this allows me to dial in how many points I want. So if I type 2, it will give me 3 points, okay, because I have 2 segments here. Okay, so I think this is good for a start, and that's almost it. It's just that we need some volume for our setup, so I'm going to copy a sphere onto these 3 points. Drop down a sphere, copy the points, and there we have the 3 spheres, and something that we need to do is to make sure that these spheres are polygons. Okay, so this is a step that's important, do not miss it. New Houdini users tend to miss this very small but important step. Okay, so select the sphere one, go to primitive and change it to polygon, and also we can very conveniently size it down here under uniform scale. Okay, to run a smoke simulation, we need to make sure that this is a volumetric geometry instead of a polygonal geometry. There's a Pyro source node that helps us to do that, and by default there's a shortcut here to help us with what we want to initialize the geometry to be, and I will choose this preset here called source smoke, and what that then gives us is a bunch of points that has the density attribute and the temperature attribute. The mode here is set to keep input, which means it will attempt to keep this points input as the Pyro source, but however I want it to be volumetrically filled up, so I'm going to change this to volume scatter, and it's a little bit too coarse now, so I'm gonna lower the particle separation to 0.05 so I get a little bit more particles like this. Okay, so that's it for the attributes, and if I middle mouse on this, so what it gives me is about close to 200 points with 2 point attributes of density, p-scale, and temperature. And next, these are still points, they have not been converted into volumes yet. To do that, I'm going to drop down a volume rasterize attributes node, and this node, what it does is it attempts to rasterize this point information into a volumetric voxel information. So what attributes do we want to rasterize? For a smoke simulation, all we need is the density attribute and the temperature attribute, so you can pick it here too, density and temperature. And then you can see that the resolution is still a little bit coarse, so I'm just also going to change this to 0.05, 0.02, 0.02, 0.005. So this gives me a decent representation of my smoke source, and that's it. The next step to do is drop down a Pyro Solver. So Houdini has made it very easy to do smoke simulation nowadays. Just inside your geometry context, drop down a Pyro Solver, and if you just go to the first frame, change your frame range from 1 to 100, and press Ctrl up, which brings you to the first frame, and press up to run the simulation. Right. And you can see that there is a smoke simulation, nothing too exciting. So now the problem is that it's going upwards. That's not very helpful for a wind tunnel, so we need to try to make it go sideways, and there's a quick way to do that, which is to change the gravity to, instead of -1 on the y-axis, to be -z or positive z, and it goes this way. And you can realize that the smoke disappears quite quickly, and that's because on the shape here, there's a dissipation strength of 0.5, so that's quite strong. I'm going to lower it down to 0.05 so it doesn't dissipate quite as fast. And you will notice that it actually doesn't get into collision with the skull at all. That's simply because we haven't set it up, right? So in here it says volumes for collision in the second stream of the Pyro Solver. So what I can then do is to ensure that this, I'll drop a null here for organization purposes, and type reference VDB collisions. Just drop it in here as the second input, color this blue, and this null does not do anything yet because it specifies that it needs a volume, but I gave it a geometry, so that's no good for Houdini. So let's address that by changing this into a volume by typing VDB from polygons, and this will give it a surface volume like this. So it might be confusing because what is going on? Why did we use this technique to create some fog volume here, and why did we use another technique, a VDB technique, to create a surface volume? It can get a little bit confusing, but all you need to know is that there are two types of volumes. One is a surface volume and one is a fog volume, as you can see in the description here. So both techniques uses voxels to store information. A distance or surface VDB describes the surface of an object, but a fog or density VDB describes the insights, the volumetric contents of the object. I hope that makes sense. And so one is a little bit foggy, and the other one is trying its best to describe the information of the surface data using voxel data like this. Okay, so having changed geometric data into a surface VDB data, we are able to feed it into the Pyro Solver like this. And if we need a bit better representation, we can lower the voxel size here, 0.05 or 0.025. So I think this is good enough, and then we can run the simulation once again. And you can see it right now, it collides, right? And if you notice that this simulation is very low resolution, so to increase the resolution, we can go under the simulation tab here, or rather under setup. And this voxel size, if we lower it, it's a smaller voxels, so it's like tinier pixels. Smaller voxel size will increase the resolution. So I'm just gonna halve it for now, 0.05, and run the simulation again. And it looks like I can halve it one more time further, 0.025, and I get a little bit more resolution like this. And you can see that the substeps is not enough. It's fast moving at the start, so we get some gaps in between here. So in order to solve that, we can go to the simulation tab here, and under global substeps, change it to 2 or 3 for a start, and see how much that resolves the gap. Right, so let's see if we can get away with 2. So that's alright, so 2 is enough. I was a bit heavy-handed with the substeps when I changed it to 3. So we can see now that that is not working in our favor, as I described earlier in the Photoshop file. In my drawing earlier, it's getting a bit out of hand, so we need to draw some lines to help us guide this smoke simulation a little bit. So to do that, I'm just going to drop down a line node, make it run from along the z-axis, 10 units long, and I'm going to use the match size to make it on the floor like this. Okay, so I have a line here, I have it this long, and I need quite a few more lines on this, so I'm just going to drop down another line and lay it out on the x-axis like this, and have 10 points on it, and let it have a match size node to centralize it to the world. And I'm going to copy the points so that I get a bunch of lines like this, and then I'm just going to copy this onto the source points like this, but only on the last index number, which is index number 2. So it's on the top frame like this. In fact, I don't need to do this. I think this is good enough. I'm just going to change this back to center and template my skull like this, and just raise it above the floor manually using a transform node. And then I'm just going to drop down a raise up and try to ray these lines onto the skull from here. And under project raise, choose minimum distance, and you can see that all the lines have been projected onto the skull like this, right? But that's not what we want. We want it to project downwards along the y-axis onto a ground with the skull on top of the ground. So let's drop down a grid, and let's merge the skull and the grid together. So this is a much better collision object for our raise up. And you can see that, yay, we managed to project these lines onto the skull and the floor, except that it appears to have entirely ignored the skull. Hey, what's going on? It's not raying properly, right? This is because our source lines over here, we don't have enough divisions, right? So after the copy the points node, we can simply resample it. So what I'm referring to is, if we can click on the point display, we only have 1 point at the start and 1 point at the end. That means there's not enough divisions to describe the ray operation. So let's drop down a resample node over here, and this is the number of points that we get by default. It looks good, and let's ray it now, and we can see, right? So what was before is some lines in the sky like this. Let's put this after, and if we ray it downwards onto the geometry, it looks like this, right? So this is a minimum distance operation. We could then increase the length of this, and then we could append a smooth node, and attempt to smooth this out, just increase the strength by quite a bit to say 100, and lower the filter quality, and that's you can see you can get something like this. So it depends on what you're trying to do. So this is something that allows us to guide the geometry to go over and above the form and come down again, right? And you can see that it's passing through the skull, and it doesn't matter too much, but what I can do is to redo this step here to reproject onto the skull and the floor like this, and then run another smooth operation that is less strong like this. We can get some detail in there. So I think this is okay. We can then choose to increase our line segments like this, before, after, but I think we can keep it somewhat like this, it's fine. And next we need to ensure that we are able to generate some vectors. Yeah, so we need to convert these lines into a velocity field. So how do we do that? If we drop down a poly frame node and change the tangent U to N and uncheck the normal, this is like a hacky way. If we show our normals now, it shows us actually what is the curve's tangent U, right? And it's pointing along the direction that we want it to point. So that is good. You can see over here. And so then we can equate this tangent name actually to just V for velocity, or vel if we're going to change it to well, let's just go with V first, because the common names for the velocity attribute on points is V, and for the velocity field is vel, so it gets confusing at this part. Let's go with V first, and what we can then do is to drop down a VDB from polygons node, and this time we won't generate a distance VDB, nor will we generate a fog, so we uncheck both, and we will turn on this surface attributes, and what we will convert is the points V attribute to a VDB name called vel, and we're going to choose displacement, velocity, or acceleration. If you look at it, we have a vel volume here, but the problem is, how are we going to convert this into volumes? We're going to use a similar technique here, where we drop down in order to convert the vel attribute into a volume, we're just going to drop down a volume rasterize attributes, and we'll type vel in here, and we should be able to get some kind of velocity field here. It's not very apparent where there's no viewport display. This usually is a bit trippy, but we have to just trust that it works. Okay, so how do we bring this into the Pyro Solver? Actually, what we can simply do, if we middle mouse on this and we see that there's a density and temperature attribute, we can simply just merge it in, right? This is the vel attribute here, the vel field here. We can simply select this both and just do a merge, and just merge it into the first indicator here. And if we middle mouse on this merge node, we can see that the density, temperature, and vel is all in here. We should be able to run our simulation. And just to prove that the velocity field is working, or at least let ourselves know that it's working, I'm just momentarily going to dive into the settings here and turn off gravity. Just change the gravity acceleration to 0, and just run straight from the density field here to make sure that it's turned off. And I'm just going to momentarily increase my voxel size and run the simulation. You can see that I have fully turned off the gravity, and now if I run the merge node that already has my velocity field merged in, you can see that it doesn't push along using the velocity field at all, right? So let's go to the sourcing tab, and we see that it's sourcing V as vel, but the problem is we've called it vel over here, so it's looking for V, right? So over here we gotta change this to V and change this to V also, right? So fingers crossed, we'll run this, and we can see that it respects the velocity attribute. And so you can see a problem here, that there's a lot of energy pushing it upwards, and we probably don't want all the energy at the front over here. We want it only after the midpoint of the skull, right? So over here, when we prepare the lines, we can drop down a clip node and clip anything that is on the z-axis like this, and anything that's below the plane. So we only get this half of the lines over here. And let's just run the simulation again. But this time we'll turn on the gravity by going to gravity acceleration, change it back to 9.8, and so the smoke moves along with gravity, and after the midpoint the velocity field takes over and tries to push it down like this. There is just one problem, is that the smoke is going through the ground, right? So in order to deal with that, I think in the Pyro Solver, on the Pyro Solver, we just need to go to Setup and look for the setting that we can turn on the ground plane. So under the Setup, treat Y as close to below, right? So that essentially gives us a ground plane at the world 0. Okay, and now you can see if I middle mouse on my Pyro Solver, we have a lot of Houdini volumes, which are in turquoise over here. And what the industry generally uses now is the VDBs, Fong VDBs. So we're going to change this to VDBs, and to do that, we just go to the Export tab, and we can basically not export the temperature, not export the flame, not export the color diffuse, and only export density and val. And also under this convert to VDB checkbox, tick it, and you will see that it's now blue volumes here. Right, so let's now run the simulation at a higher resolution. I'm just going to change this to back to 0.025, and then drop down the file cache node, change this to for interoperability with other softwares. I encourage you to change this to cache this as a VDB. So let's just call this smoke sim, and instead of bjo.sc, let's call it VDB and run the cache. But before I run the cache, you can middle mouse here and see that we have a lot of detailed attributes over here and a shop material path and stuff like that. So I think we can toss them all away by dropping down a clean node. So here we will just check these two boxes, and when it's on star, it actually cleans everything, including the names. All the point attributes, primitive attributes, and detail attributes, they're all cleared. That's good for us, but we shouldn't clear the name of our simulation. So I'm gonna change, just gonna accept name over here. Instead of removing all the attributes, I'm just gonna remove everything but the name attribute, and that will preserve the names of our density and velocity fields. And I'm just gonna run the smoke simulation, and I'll see you in a bit, probably in a second, because the magic of a recording. Okay, so I interrupted the cache because I noticed that it is not as streamlined as I imagine it to be, because I think I could taper the ends of the points over here. Okay, in order to encourage a little bit more tapering towards the end, I'm just gonna go over to the raise up over here, or rather, yeah, right after the raise up here. I'm just gonna choose all the points that are before the clip node. Just gonna press S on the viewport and select all the points manually like this. Press tab over the viewport and choose group, and then this group I can name it for organization purposes. Let's call it ends, and I'm just gonna drop down a soft transform node and operate only on the ends points, and just scale down on the x-axis, just scale it to 0, and I can adjust my soft radius here. So you can see that I'm encouraging the volumes, the smoke, to actually taper towards the end here. So that's just a little quick trick, and we can run the simulation again. For the sake of for the tutorial, I'm just going to lower the resolution here. So it's 0.03, and just run the simulation. So the simulation is done. Just have to drop down a file node and point to the VDB sequence, and you can see that it looks very messy here. This is because the velocity field and the density field is stacked on top of each other. So I drop down a blast node and type add name equals density and delete the non-selected. That deletes away the velocity field, and what we are left here is only the density field. And then we can render this, but you can see that the smoke simulation is not like super high res or anything like that, and we can give it some fake resolution by running a secondary particle simulation. So let's on this source spheres over here, what we can do is to drop down a popnet, and by default, if we run the popnet, it will generate a lot of points on these spheres. But if we dive inside, we can wire in a popped vect by volumes, and we can choose to reference the velocity volume, which we have here in our cache, right? So instead of blasting away the velocity field here, let's make another version of this blast node and uncheck delete non-selected. So this is our velocity field. Let's drop down null here to just call this reference velocity field and color it blue, and dive into the popnet. Under popped effect by volumes, I'm just going to choose the reference velocity, and I'm going to choose to update the velocity and have it fully and faithfully follow the velocity field by changing the blend to 1, and just run this quick particle simulation here. So you can see that we have a particle simulation, and it's pretty fast. So in that case, it doesn't harm if I just go to my source here and change my birth to 50,000 instead. So, and then run this particle simulation like this. Okay, now that the particles are cached, I realized that the velocity field is going a little bit crazy over here and that is working against our favor. So let's just cheaply remove all the particles where the velocity is too little. So just drop down a group expression node, and we'll just write a quick expression here to say that this group name is called slow, and let's group up the particles where their velocity is too low. So the length of their velocity, v at v, is less than a certain threshold. Press this button here and you can see what we are selecting here. So like all these, they have gotten too slow, 0.03. We're just gonna plus them away. So drop down plus node and choose slow. So essentially we can delete all the points that are way too slow. So there used to be this many points and we are down to this many points. And I think we can increase this quite a bit more, say 5. So this leaves us with only the fast moving particles. And next time I'm just going to drop down a point wrangle to randomize an attribute randomize to randomize the p-scale of the particles. It's a 1 dimension and just 0.5 to 1 will do. And I'm just going to drop down null node and call it out particles and color it green. And for our density field, I'm just going to call it out density, and we're ready to render. So let's put another out node for the skull here, out skull, and just go outside, drop down 3 geonodes, 1 for the skull, 1 for the density, and 1 for particles, and maybe just one more grid for the ground. So I'm just going to build the setup that we've been using throughout this whole series. I need some geometries for a skull first, so drop down object merge, go to navigate to setup and pick up out skull, copy this object merge, go to density, pick up the density field, jump outside, go to particles, paste, and pick up the particles. And finally on the grid, just drop down some UVs, UV project, initialize to the best plane so that we got some UVs in case we need to shade it. And then we can size this plane bigger, 2 units, duplicate it, rotate it by 90 degrees, move it backwards, something like this, and make another copy of it and rotate it 90 degrees this way and move it backwards on this axis. Right, so here we have our usual rendering setup. So let's prepare the materials. Let's go to, I'll press Ctrl 1 on my OBJ tab and go to the materials context and press Ctrl 2. Drop down 3 Redshift material builder nodes, 4, just duplicate this. The first one will be the skull, the second one will be the smoke, the density, sorry, let's stay consistent. Density, the third will be the particles. The fourth will be the background stuff. So let's just drag and drop the skull to the skull, the density to the density, the particles to the particles, the BG to all 3 BGs. And let's control click on the camera icon here and just change this to render cam and press on the padlock here, turn my render cam focal length to maybe 120 and change my resolution to HD. Just frame this. Be sure to press this padlock over here so that we are essentially moving the camera when we tumble our viewport. So something like this here should be okay. The ground is not big enough, so on grid 1 I'm just going to increase this to 4, and this is it. Let's get a bit of a camera orbit here. Drop down null node, $FF, multiply by 0.1 on the y-axis, and just add a little bit of camera shake on the translation here. How do we do that? Right click on the translate node here, go to motion FX, click on noise, and adjust the settings to taste, and jump back out. We should be able to say hide the simulation so that we can preview our camera move. Check the real-time toggle here, and yep, so this is our camera move. The orbit is a little bit slow, so I'm just going to change this to 0.3, so this is okay. Maybe on my expression I'm just going to minus 15 units. Okay, so this is alright. So let's just look at what the simulation looks like. Okay, so before that, I need to dial in some settings here. So all the surface defaults are fine. The thing I want to pay attention to is this density one, because this is a redshift material, which is not a volumetric material. So let's just toss it. The volumetric material in redshift is called RS volume. So you can plug it into, instead of what we usually plug into for surface materials, we'll plug it into volume. And it already has set up to pull the density attribute for both the scatter and the absorption, so we don't have to worry too much. The two things that we need to take note is the scatter coefficient and the absorption coefficient. And in my experience, it's best that they stay in balance with each other, meaning that if I scatter 1 unit, I should absorb 1 unit. And if anything is too out of balance, it will either look like steam, or if it has more absorption than scatter, then it will look like thick smoke, which you can use it to your advantage. But if you want just generic looking smoke, then it's best to keep it in balance. So if you choose this to be 50, then you can change this to be 50. It depends on what is the value of your density in your VDB. Alright, so in this case, let me just drop down a light dome and choose NHDRI and just go to redshift, render view. Sorry, let me just hop over to the out context, press Ctrl 3 for a quick mark, and drop down a redshift render node, and just be sure to pick up the correct camera, and on IPR choose this live sub updates. These 3, I always turn them on. Right, I have a preset here. I can now go to, right now our particles won't know to render as particles yet. I need to go to the redshift obj tag and go to particles, render object as particles, and make sure the global scale is scaled down to 0.001 for a start, so that it doesn't get too big and sometimes it crashes. We just need to do our material assignments. Just check that. So on here it's for the density, on the particles it's redshift particles. So that's all good. And let's just kick off a render. Here you can see our render, and we don't see our smoke. So for starters, let me rotate the light so that I can get a bit more shadows like this, and I can start to see the smoke over here. So if I want them a little bit more dense, I can jump over to my shader here and change this to say 100, and then the absorption also to 100, and you can see that's how you get quite a thick smoke. So what I was referring to just now, if one of it is not so balanced, for example more absorption than scattering, so let's say make it 10 times more, and you see it's more like soot. And if it's the other way around, it's 110 here, then it's a bit too much scattering, right? So just do it to taste, right? In this case, I'll just maybe leave them at 20, and we have something like this. So the wind tunnel effect is actually not so strong, so maybe I'll just do 2. Yeah, I think that's fine. And you will notice that the smoke when in the shadow is not very obvious. If we want the wind tunnel effect to be very apparent, we probably shouldn't use this lighting setup. So let's, but I like the lighting on this one because it sculpts the form really well. So this is something that we didn't plan for, so let's see how we can solve it. Firstly, on the background, I don't want the ground to be too shiny, so I'm just going to change it. Something like the demo. So this pink here, make it rough and make it less saturated, like this. And I think my light is too strong, so on my light dome, just drop the exposure to drop down by -1, and on the skull I can choose a preset here, maybe choose plastic and just make it white color. Just wondering if it stands out if it's black. Nah. Okay, so let's try to check out what our particles are doing. Sometimes it's good to isolate whatever you're working on, so let's hide the density field. And where are our particles, right? So I think we have sized it down too small here, 0.001. Let's just change it to 0.01, and we can see our particles here. You can see that the velocity field, it's not turned on, so jump over to our redshift ROP here. Under redshift, under motion blur, turn on motion blur, and then we can see motion blur on our particles. Let's just refresh the render, then we can see our particles motion blur like this. Okay, then on the particles, I think we do not have to render reflection on particles, and we also can make the particles a white color. You can see that even without smoke, we generate a bunch of particles, and when they work together, there's seemingly a lot more detail in the smoke, but it's a bit too big now, so let me just drop down the scale to 0.01 or 0.005. Let's just isolate the particles again, maybe 0.0075. It's good. Yep, so let me just attempt to rotate the lights a little bit to see if we can see our smoke a little bit better. Something like this is good, but I just want to cast more light so that the density of the smoke gets it. So maybe I can adjust the grid 2's x-axis here, just move it backwards a little bit. Yep, like this. Yep, so that the smoke gets into the light, and we can see our effect much better. So I found that the particles were a little bit overpowering, so I just sized it down to 0.025. now that it's all in the light, right? So it's more like a supporting role for the density field. You can see here it's not very detailed looking, but if I turn on the particles, it shouldn't be the case of suddenly there's a lot of volume gained. All we want is to give the illusion of detail. So we can use this a bit more sparingly, like don't go all bananas with this. Like 0.0025 is good. Like for example 0.01, this is pretty crazy. It's not so much of a wind tunnel effect, it's more like a little mini storm over here, right? So just do it to taste. It looks cool, yeah. So actually you can do whatever you want. And on the skull, just change my reflection to 0.5, so it's not so reflective. Yeah, so I noticed that the density is a bit too strong, so in fact I went the other way to change it to 0.5. So I'm just trying to go for something really subtle here so that we can, you know, the wind tunnel effect is not meant to look like a storm. So that's I think this is it looks pretty alright. Okay guys, so this is the result we got today. I hope you enjoyed this quicker tutorial today. I don't think it ran for an hour, or maybe it did, I'm not sure. I'm just gonna edit this down now. And yeah, look forward to the next episode. We have covered almost all the simulation topics. We've covered flip simulation, so we are now down to the last 3 episodes. So recently I'm into the pattern making, something like just trying to make your own jacket, make your own t-shirt. So I'm not sure if that's too advanced for this series, so you can let me know in the comments below if you would like to learn some. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So recently I'm exploring pattern making, so just tailoring, how to make your own clothing in Houdini. So if this is something of interest to you, please let me know in the comments below. The setting up is a little bit involved, so maybe if anything I'll leave it to the last episode of Houdini Houdono, who knows, right? So this 10-part mini-series is coming to an end. I'm always sharing some tips and tricks on CGI and stuff like that on my Instagram, so please go over to my Instagram handle is @Ronald_Fong. So here you can see sharing some tips on particle evaction here, which is the trick that I just showed you guys. Oh, or maybe you guys want to learn colored smoke and just can make a really short one for the next episode. Other than that, yeah, just thinking about what I can cover in the last 2 episodes. Yeah, so please leave a comment below. And other than that, because yeah, I think the thing is because I covered everything already I wanted to cover. So, or maybe some hair simulation will be pretty good. Yeah, we're done with episode 7, and we have episode 8 and 9 before episode 10, where I'm thinking of doing this one, and maybe some food stuff, right? So it seems like the food stuff is quite popular now to do in the CGI. Yeah, so I can show you guys how to do something like this. It's not anything new, it's flip simulation and stuff like that. I'm not sure, this is supposed to be a simulation series. Let's see. Yeah, or maybe we can revisit some older topics, or we can play with the idea of combining different simulation systems together, for example RPD and Vellum, something like this. Yeah, I think episode 8 I can cover some hair simulation, and then episode 9 is where I can do some combining of simulation techniques, and episode 10 we'll do this vellum drape setup. I think it'll be quite cool. So thanks guys. Let's see what else is there to say. Oh yeah, please DM me wind, W-I-N-D, if you would like the annotated version of this zip file. I'll spend some time to annotate this Houdini file over here, so that you can follow along. The setup over here, I'll just annotate this file. And let's let's also do a recap of what we've done, right? Just to refresh everybody's memory. So we got a skull in, we transformed it and placed it on the floor here, and next we generated a line and placed it at the front of the sphere of the skull over here, and just copied some spheres onto it and used Pyro Solver to convert it into some particles with a density and temperature attribute, and used volume rasterize attributes node to rasterize the density and temperature attribute, and ran a simulation using the Pyro Solver node. We also need to fit in the collision here, so we used the VDB from polygons node to convert this into a surface VDB and fed it into the solver here. And then we use a clean node to clean away all the other garbage attributes and groups that we do not need, and we cached it, and this is what we ended up with, a density attribute and a velocity attribute into a VDB file, which by the way you can bring it to Blender or any other software that you wish to render this in. Otherwise, one blast node to blast away the velocity so that we can render only the density, and another blast node to just isolate the velocity field, which we ran a particle of action simulation here. We cached it and it was looking a little bit messy, so wrote a group expression here to say that the speed of it, which is just write the function length v at v, it will give us the speed, and if we say it's slower than 1 unit, it will all put it in a group called slow. Next, we append a blast node to blast all the points that are slow. Right, so this is a bit neater. We don't have straggling points. Every point is exciting and moving. And then we drop down an attribute randomize node to make sure that the particles are randomized from 0.5 to 1 so that there's a randomization of scale. And out here, we shaded all the particles and we covered the shading of how to shade the density field. Just as a reminder, keep this scatter coefficient and absorption coefficient in balance for generic looking smoke. If you want it to look closer to steam, then you could do with less absorption. If you want it closer to soot, then you can do with more absorption. Okay, so I hope this tutorial helps. Smoke, as I mentioned, is one of the topics when I was a student. It sounds very scary, but because the tools nowadays are really pretty good, so I think maybe even people of my age who got into CG at a time where smoke is pretty scary to do, give it a try now. It's really not that difficult. Essentially, it only needs 3 nodes to set it up. One is the Pyro Source node, the Volume Rasterize node, and then you drop down the Pyro Solver and really you get the smoke. All the other nodes over here are just stuff to contextualize the smoke simulation and to art direct it, right? So it's when you get the grasp of it, it's actually really fun. See you guys next week where we cover some hair simulation, right? Yeah, one last reminder, please DM me wind for the annotated file of this wind tunnel setup, and I'm just gonna leave it on this render here. See you next week, Friday at 6 PM, where it's typically when I release these Houdini Houdono tutorials. And please remember to subscribe. I've never actually mentioned subscribe before. Yeah, you can consider subscribing to this YouTube channel so that you get some notifications. I think it helps to spread the word so that these tutorials actually reach more people. Thanks, and once again, it's Ronald speaking. See you, take care, and bye bye.